They are building mini Silicon Valleys all around China. And it's only useful if you help the good ones, the productive ones. And so they do that. They don't just help one or two, they help thousands. So if you think about corruption and the lack of democratic mechanisms, there are much more nuanced mechanisms of competition and checks and balances in China that we may not see from the outside. That's what happened to the EVs. Within 10 years, China became the largest producer and consumers of EVs. And it does help that the government can roll out 4 million EV charging stations around the country, as opposed to 160,000 in the US. It critically does make that kind of difference.
Meet Professor Keyu Jin, a brilliant Chinese economist who once taught at the prestigious London School of Economics. In this captivating talk, she unveils why so many American economists have fundamentally misunderstood China's economy. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.
China is not just a centralized system. That's what we all think. It's politically centralized, but it's radically economically decentralized. And that lies in there lies the fundamental success story of China's economy. It's all these mayors running around, the lady that I mentioned, since the 1980s. They're entrepreneurial. They're often risk takers. They want to bring in the best technologies and investments and capital, and they help the private entrepreneurs. Why do they help the private entrepreneurs? Because they are the best. They want to help the best, not the worst or the most politically connected, because by helping the good entrepreneurs, you're creating an entire ecosystem of success. They bring jobs. They bring fiscal revenue. And by the way, this city, more than half of the fiscal revenues comes from taxes, okay, not from real estate. They have very low GDP, debt to GDP ratio. So again, I'll come back to what we should take out from this story. They want to help these private entrepreneurs because then they create the retail sector. Then even the real estate that they own is worth more. They are building mini Silicon Valleys all around China. And it's only useful if you help the good ones, the productive ones. And so they do that. They don't just help one or two, they help thousands. And so if you look at a picture of the distribution of unicorn companies in China, they're spread all over, with exception of the western, certain central provinces, but really not just in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, as you all know. Even in a second-tier cities, whether it's Wuxi, Wuhan, Suzhou, Hefei, many places you've not heard of, there are global quantum avenues running through, global companies. There are 300 EV cars all in China, and they're all backed by some local provincial party secretary, and they compete. So they're spread all over. And I think that decentralized nature, what I call the mayor economy, is really important to understand, not only to explain China's past growth, also to realize today's challenges, but also to look forward in the future. Why? Because it's the same model, same platform they're using to develop renewables, undertake the green transition, and all of that. It's the same model because the central government needs the local governments to implement. And what do the local mayors get out of this? Why do they want to do the best thing for the economy? Obviously, they're not elected. They don't face re-election pressure because they have political ambitions to rise up the ranks. The ones that deliver the best economic results, coupled with a bunch of other things now. It's not as simple as GDP. In the past, it was just GDP. And that's why everyone was what we call GDP worshiping those days. And that's how you climbed up the ranks, because then you can become the provincial city party secretary, and then provincial party secretary, you become at the very top rank of the central government. Actually, President Xi's father was one of those successful political leaders that implemented reforms, made an economic success, and went straight to the top ranks of the leadership. And they're all competing with each other. So if you think about corruption and the lack of democratic mechanisms, there are much more nuanced mechanisms of competition and checks and balances in China that we may not see from the outside. And so these cadres rotate 3 to 5 years. They compete with each other, right? And there's a lot of monitoring systems involved from the central top down. It's a convoluted apparatus, but it's certainly not just a one-man show. That would be a very, very naive reading of what's actually going on in China. And certainly for the economy, it is absolutely critical. So the Mayer model. Now, let me tell you another example. Solar panels, right? Look, China led the solar panel boom in the world, and that really happened after the mid 2000s. And um, something that happened then was that the Chinese governments encouraged the local governments to implement a series of supportive measures for the solar industries. I want to caveat the support by critically emphasizing that it's not just financial subsidies. There are now far and few between because, first of all, the local governments are pretty much um, um, a bankrupt, right? Because of 3 years of PCR testing that cost, 4 trillion RMB. So they don't have that financial muscle. It's not just the financial subsidy, it's everything else. It's attracting talent. This provincial party secretary told me that she subsidizes 10% of the down payment of real estate, your first purchase of house, if you're a talented worker. Um, it is coming back to what I was saying about the implicit discrimination of the financial system, helping them coordinate with local banks, local state banks, helping them coordinate financing. It is other kinds of overcoming business barriers, which for any developing country amounts to insurmountable barriers if you don't have their support. So it's not just the financial subsidy. But the solar panel was very interesting because ever since the 2005 government introduction of these government policies, support policies were introduced, they were implemented in different cities at different periods of time, different times in different geographical spaces and times. And I don't have this picture with me, but it is a phenomenal, remarkable, scene. Between 2005 and 2017, you saw the solar patents, internationally recognized patents, first of all, just completely exploding and exactly in the way that is proportionate to the policies, support policies that were introduced at the city levels. So before we want to hesitate about what state can do or should not do, and I also have my own ambiguous feelings about that, it's important to recognize that that model has worked in many areas and at many aspects in China, and that's the mayor model, but coupled with that central direction. And it's the same thing now with the renewables. Again, the same model. Robotics. Okay, same thing. Demographics. We talk about demographics as one of the potentially leading causes of or potential threats to the Chinese economy. Well, first of all, China exports 50% of the world's robots. If there was a policy in place to encourage factories to adopt robots, it would just be spread out very, very quickly, and that would lead to automation. Very interesting, recent, broader study academically, very important study, showed that after 1990, the more aging countries are actually richer, not poorer, they're richer. That was not the case before 1990. If you take the sample of these countries, they were poor. And the reason is 1990 being so important because that's the arrival of automated technologies. And these countries tended to adopt more robots and automated technologies, and that tended to expand output in lots of various aspects. I'm not going to deliberate on this issue, but just trying to emphasize that huge mayor economy model can be very important in enacting systemic-wide changes very shortly.
If you're enjoying this so far, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Now, let's dive into the interview.
That's what happened to the EVs. Within 10 years, China became the largest producer and consumers of EVs, and it does help that the government can roll out 4 million EV charging stations around the country, as opposed to 160,000 in the US. It critically does make that kind of difference.
You talked about the youth, and in your book, you tell us that this is a different generation in many ways, and the lack of ability to exploit their knowledge and skills is a key problem. To what extent can that also be a problem for stability in China?
First of all, I would say do watch out for the new generation. They're radically different from my parents' generation who went through the Cultural Revolution. Some went through the Great Famine. They've seen huge vicissitudes. They're very risk averse. They're high savers. And they're very, very, very hardworking, that generation. I think that was a big part of the global problem when you got a billion more people in the labor force in the world, all taking 3 shifts per night. Um, that causes a global challenge. That's not the new generation. They like to travel. They spend twice as much as, you know, people born after 1980s spend twice as much, even compared to those born in 1970s, on things like apparel and food and entertainment. So with a bit of prosperity, and that's the maturity of a country and economy over time, is a more relaxed, less ambitious, less hardworking, more socially conscious. Why? Because they can afford to. It's no longer just about sustaining one's basic needs. It's about, if you look at the surveys of this new generation, they care about animal rights, they care about the environment, they care about social equity, they like diversity, they care about minority rights, things that previous generations never debated about. So I think it's the coming age of China with that new generation that is a potential source of hope. But the challenge, as you mentioned now, is that many of them are not finding jobs. There's 100 million more additional college graduates in the last 10 years because the premier from many years ago decided to expand secondary education. Um, the first thing is, I think it's primarily still, there are two things. One is an economic situation right now, bad economy. The second is that, look, there are a lot of jobs in China waiting to be filled, but they're in manufacturing. And China wants to be the smart manufacturer of the world, right? A larger, smarter Germany, if you will, based on powered by AI and communications.
And that's interesting. You mentioned Germany, not the US.
Not the US. I think there's actually a very little overlap with the financialized knowledge economy of the US, service-oriented. Chinese government officials want China to be a producer of stuff in its mind that is real, not property, not finance, and all of that. I'm not saying I agree with that view at all, but Germany is a paragon of success. And so that's where the jobs are. There are 25 million missing jobs, or jobs to be ready to be filled in the next 3 years in manufacturing. But these kids, they graduate from college. They don't want to take up these jobs. That's the mismatch.
And is that a potential source of instability in China?
Look, the government watches it very closely. But I say that because of there are many challenges in China today, that's not the first order one. The first order one is real estate, because that concerns every single family in China. If they really let the real estate go or the prices drop, then look, that's going to be the real threat to social stability. But they're not going to do that. So.
And I have to also congratulate you on your book, because it has been named by Forbes as one of the 10 sort of must-reads for board members. And in the book, you've spent quite a lot of time busting myths. What do you see as the most harmful myth about China for investors?
It's hard to say what's the most harmful. I think it's all pretty bad. Just mistrust feeds on to misunderstanding, feeds on mistrust. But I'd start with the Chinese people. As much as I'm an economist, I realize that a lot of this is social and cultural differences. There's a presumption that somehow everybody in Chinese is utterly miserable. It's something that I find very hard I find it very ironic given how bad the situation is pretty much everywhere else. But the Chinese people don't think the same things. There's a huge difference in preferences at the cultural level. You can see by international surveys. So the Chinese people expects their government to do a lot. Some might see that as totally intolerable what the Chinese state is doing, but they actually expect that. In return, they give some deference, but not blind submission, because they do revolt. And I think another thing to understand for investors is that Chinese policies or sentiment or sorry, government preferences do shift much more than you think. I always joke that in the US, parties change, but policies don't. In China, it's the opposite. And you can see pendulum swings. If they think that they really made a mistake, they will radically change. Now, there might be a time lag before they actually realize that or finally submit to it, but they can change from left to right, from one far end to the other. And I think that's the spirit with which we should, think about China. A few months ago, or say before the 20th Party Congress, it was a lot of confidence. It was a lot about ideology. It was a lot about security. Today, it's now the economy is back. It's now about the economy.
And that's a wrap for today. If you had a great time watching, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a future update. Got thoughts? Drop them in the comments. We love hearing from you. And if you're hungry for more, there's plenty waiting for you. Just click on the next video and keep the momentum going. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.